It's been nearly a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and in the months since, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians have died. Millions have been displaced, and in response, Ukraine's allies have sent over billions in financial and military aid. That includes the U.S. President Joe Biden has been fiercely critical of Vladimir Putin's war, which he's called a brutal, premeditated, and needless conflict.
They're children of the Cold War, and they see each other and their countries through the Cold War. Biden saw Putin for what he is, a KGB revanchist who wants to remake the Russian Empire.
Just how effective can President Biden be in pushing back Putin's aggression? And how have his predecessors, from Clinton through Trump, set the stage for what we're seeing now? Those relationships are the focus of a new Frontline documentary, Putin and the Presidents. The film's director, Michael Kirk, joins me now. Michael Kirk, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, this documentary, as we said, takes us through 5 presidents who have had to deal with Vladimir Putin. And while we've had a lot of change here, Putin seems to have been pretty consistent throughout the whole thing. The first president, of course, was Bill Clinton. And it seems like he got a pretty good sense of Vladimir Putin in their initial meeting.
Well, he found out he didn't like him very much. He found out that Putin didn't seem to, Clinton was near the end of his presidency at the time, and I think he expected a little more courtesy and maybe Putin to kiss the ring almost of the American president after all that America had done for Russia during the Yeltsin presidency. But Putin was not at all playing that game. He sat and he slouched in his chair and all the things. He did all the things that would indicate to the president of Russia, to the president of the United States, that the president of Russia is not at all interested in him, and he's history, and Putin is going to go his own direction. It sends Clinton around the bend, and he goes to Boris Yeltsin and literally says to him, "I don't think this guy has a democracy in his heart." In the end, Yeltsin would come to believe that as well. But we show a press conference the next day when Clinton is walking out with Putin and tries to find some adjectives to describe him that are positive. And it's very clear that he's choking on the words. And when you look at the cutaways of Putin's face, it's clear that Putin is sort of rolling his eyes like a recalcitrant ninth grader in the presence of the president of the United States.
Yeah, it's actually striking, I think, in all 5 presidents that you show in the documentary, how much that body language and all those symbols kind of come through in the eye rolls, and just how Putin sits, for example, when he's having a conversation with somebody. There's sort of a power dynamic even there.
Yes, he slouches. He waves his arms. He's dismissive. With Obama, for example, he talks for 45 minutes uninterrupted at the beginning of the conversation, a list of grievances that he feels that from being slighted by the United States and by other presidents who he feels have mishandled him and mishandled Russia. People tell us, I hadn't heard this really before we made this film, people tell us that Putin has a deep racist streak inside of him. And he didn't like Obama because Obama was a black man and a black president. And in his presence, in comes the president of the United States, who's a black person. And Putin is just not buying any of it. And by the end of this conversation, which, as I say, was a one-sided dialogue, Obama has just sort of thrown his hands up. He's got lots of fish to fry back in the United States, an economy that's cratering, all the things that he wants to do. And he just says to himself, and I think to his vice president, Joe Biden, "I'm done with this guy. Over to you, Joe. You take care of it."
Right. Before we get to Obama, though, we have to talk about President George W. Bush, right, who
yes.
famously, when he first met with Putin, said he looked into his eyes and he saw his soul. But that relationship sort of didn't last. You talk in the documentary about the impact that the Iraq War had on the U.S. and Russian relationship, and it was not a good one.
Well, Putin, is no fool. he sits there and sees America moving into what he considers his backyard, which is the Middle East. And he sees, as a despot, he sees us deciding the American democracy with a handful of allies to remove a despot from in Saddam Hussein from Iraq. And he says, wait a minute, these guys are not playing fair. If they're going to come for Saddam Hussein, what stops them from coming for me? So, of course, what he hoped would be, I think, at the very beginning, and I mean very beginning, he hoped he could manipulate George W. Bush. He had a dossier prepared on him. He was ready to go. He kind of did a flim-flam thing about that he had a religious miracle that he believed in, and Bush, a very religious person, said, well, I've looked in his eyes and I've seen his soul and I trust it. Well, Bush's administration, the people in the State Department, just about choked to death when they heard him say that. They were sort of hoping to marginalize and put Putin in a box somewhere, but now Bush has elevated him to this status of near sainthood. And it isn't until we decide to go our own way, attack Iraq, and do a number of other things that the relationship is really torn. And by then, Putin has gone to Georgia, invaded Georgia, is holding on to Georgia, and is trying to bring other parts of the old Soviet Union back together. And Bush at the Olympics in Beijing moves over, sits down next to Putin, and says to him, we show this in the film, says to him, you got to knock this off, Vladimir. This just isn't going to stand. And Putin looks at him and basically says, look, it's my game. It's my part of the world, and I'm going to do whatever I want, and America can't stop me. And the fact is, America doesn't stop him. And that teaches Putin a very big lesson, a lesson all bullies test, and then find out that there's no pushback from the United States President, George W. Bush. Well, what else can I grab? And that starts the game of what is basically a 20-year war with America and the West being waged by Vladimir Putin.
Right. Really taught him that lesson that he could get away with it.
Exactly. I mean, this is a former KGB officer. This is a guy who knows how to play dirty, how to infight, how to make grand decisions. This is a guy who believes that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the last century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is a guy who believes that Russia without Ukraine is just a country, but Russia with Ukraine is an empire. That man is who George Bush discovers is sitting next to him at the Olympics and telling him to buzz off. He's going to do whatever he wants to do. And that sets the table for Obama.
Yeah, and then as you said, Putin's reaction to Obama was racist and largely dismissive. And Obama turned to his then Vice President, Joe Biden, and says, you take the lead on this one. But then Putin invades Crimea. And Biden and Obama had very different thoughts about how that should be handled, right?
Well, there was a real move, but there were a lot of Americans and American State Department people in Ukraine at the time, and they saw what was beginning to happen. That not only Crimea, but the Donbass and other areas. Putin sends in soldiers without insignia. And they're sort of roaming around and taking over parts of Ukraine. He's really making an incursion, a test case to see what's going to happen. And Biden and many, many people from the State Department came forward to the president at the time, Barack Obama, and said, these people need missiles, they need tanks, they need ammunition, the kind of things we're arming them with now. And Obama said, well, let me take it under advisement. And Biden made a really strong case. This must happen. We've got to stop this guy. And he was joined by John Brennan from the CIA. They both made the case. This guy's a schoolyard bully, and there's only one way to stop a schoolyard bully, and that's to bloody his nose. But Obama takes it under advisement, takes a long walk around the backyard of the White House, and comes back and says to them, nope, I'm not going to do it. Biden is shocked, mystified that he wouldn't do it. It's a breach between Biden and Obama at the time. and it sends a direct message to Putin, which we see the fruit of a few years later, which is we're not going to push back. We're not going to protect these people. You're on your own. It's your region. Go right ahead. And as Obama said, hey, I wasn't elected to protect the people of Ukraine. I was elected to protect the people of the United States of America. And that is a straight line. And I think a lot of people we talked to for this film said a misjudgment by President Obama.
And so interesting, of course, that vice president that wanted to do more is, of course, now our president. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about Trump. We had this 2016 election. It was widely understood that Russia interfered in that election. The intelligence community here said that that was what happened, and Bush infamously said he trusted President Putin more than he trusted his own intelligence. And in fact, yesterday, he said on Truth Social, he reiterated that. He said the same thing. He called the people in U.S. intelligence lowlifes and said that he trusted Putin over them. What is with that?
Well, you could. We ended up taking this line through the film when we talked to John Bolton and lots of people who are really close to, excuse me, to Trump, who also know a lot about Russia and Russian policy. There were not a lot of those people in the Oval Office or in the White House, but there were at the State Department and other places, and they all said they believed, and Bolton told us he thought that Putin believed that Trump was a fool and was playing him. That moment you're talking about. The Helsinki moment where people say people in authority, people from all over the world say they've never seen a president of the United States do anything like that ever in their lives. Give credibility to the president, the despot, the dictator of his enemy, Russia. And let him make that argument that he didn't have anything to do with whatever happened in the summer of 2016, which was by then well known and understood by American intelligence and the world. So what you have here is Putin, at least what people told us, Putin really believing that he can call the shots and manipulate Trump any way he wanted, and there's plenty of evidence of that. You see it in the film, and the bromance gets struck and started, and it's in some ways unseemly between the two of them. And what Putin, the way everybody we talk to talks about it, that what Putin was doing was just waiting for Trump's reelection so that he could fire the starting gun and take over Ukraine. He was ready to go. He was determined to do it. He wanted to create the empire. He had a president of the United States that he knew would not drop the hammer on him, and he was ready to go. And then all of a sudden, Biden wins, his enemy.
So, yes, can we speak about what Biden's reaction is and how it's different from his predecessors? I mean, everything you describe leads up to this moment, but Biden's taking a different tack.
Yes, if all the other presidents misjudged, mishandled, used whatever, misunderstood, whatever you want to say about Putin, one thing is true about Joe Biden. He'd crossed swords with Putin. He had gone out we visited Moscow as vice president. He had gone to the University of Moscow and encouraged the students to take to the streets to defend democracy and freedom of speech. He had waved the red flag in front of Putin just a few times, and Putin was extremely angry about it, and in fact cleared the streets. And arrested a lot of people and really cracked down after Biden and Hillary Clinton, who had made some statements too. So Biden is, as president, Biden is saying, I've got a lot of things I have to do. One of the things I have to do is I have to reinvigorate NATO and get the 40 countries lined up. I've got to build an alliance among liberal democracies in the world to ward off what seemed completely apparent to Antony Blinken and Biden. Blinken, who was with Biden all he's like Zelig in the room with Biden wherever Biden went as vice president, and now, of course, as president, he's the Secretary of State, and told us, and it was a wonderful and long interview with Secretary Blinken, and he just said Biden was determined from the very beginning to treat the guy like a schoolyard bully, and we're not going to put up with it. And he thought everybody else had pretty much misjudged him, and the judgment now is we've got to arm and help the Ukrainians, and they've got to fight back, and they've got to send a strong message. So that's how we that's where we found ourselves a year ago.
Yeah.
They also received a lot of secret intelligence that woke them all up. And as much as maybe even Biden was hoping he wouldn't have this as a crisis in his first couple of years of his presidency, man, when they saw what they saw, they knew he was going to strike, and they knew they had to arm it. And they even called him and said, you know what, Vladimir, we know what you're going to do.
Yeah.
That we have, sophisticated stuff. We know, and still Putin he fired up the engines, and away they went.
All right. It's a fascinating documentary. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about it. It really explains everything that leads up to this moment we're in today. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.